Here's a simple question that should have a simple answer. If a city floods, you clean up the mud, you restore the buildings, you pump out the water and move on with your life. That is what humans have done for thousands of years after every natural disaster. It is common sense. It is basic engineering. It is what any rational civilization would do. So why did dozens of cities across the world do the exact opposite between 1840 and 1880? Instead of removing the mysterious layers of compacted earth that suddenly appeared around their buildings, they raised their streets. Instead of digging out their first floors, they sealed them forever. Instead of restoring structures to their original height, they turned ground floors into basements and pretended nothing happened. And here is the part that keeps me awake at night. They all did it at the same time. Chicago, Boston, San Francisco, New York, Seattle, Denver, and that is just America. Across the Atlantic, the same phenomenon repeated in Paris, Vienna, Warsaw, St. Petersburg, Hamburg, Turin, Lisbon, Istanbul, Melbourne. Different governments, different languages, different climates, different political systems. Yet the same inexplicable response to the same inexplicable event. The official explanation is always drainage, urban modernization, sanitary reform, street improvement projects. These phrases appear in every city council record, every engineering report, every historical account. They sound reasonable until you start asking follow-up questions. If drainage was the problem, why not install proper sewers and leave the buildings alone? Cities have been solving drainage issues for millennia without burying entire floors underground. If modernization was the goal, why not demolish old structures and build new ones at the correct height? That is what modern cities do today. If sanitary reform required higher streets, why did the reform happen simultaneously across continents that had no coordinated public health policy? The questions multiply the deeper you dig, and that phrase takes on new meaning when you realize what these cities were actually doing. Because the photographic evidence from this period shows something the official narrative cannot explain. Workers were not building up. They were digging down. They were excavating buildings that had been swallowed by earth. They were uncovering windows and doors that somehow ended up below street level. They were fighting their way back into structures that looked far older and far more sophisticated than anything the 19th century was supposed to produce. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented history hiding in plain sight. The photographs exist. The engineering reports exist. The buried floors exist. You can visit them today in cities across America and Europe. The only thing that does not exist is a satisfying explanation for how they got there. Let us start with what Americans know best, our own cities, because the evidence is not hiding in obscure European archives. It is right here beneath our feet in some of the most famous urban centers in the country. Chicago is perhaps the most dramatic example. In 1855, the city began what engineers called the most ambitious urban project in American history. They raised the entire downtown by 4 to 14 feet, not gradually over decades, within a few years. Massive buildings were jacked up on thousands of screws while workers filled the space beneath with earth and rubble. Some structures were lifted while still occupied, with businesses operating normally as the ground literally rose around them. The official story claims this was necessary because Chicago sat on swampy ground that caused sewage problems. Fair enough. Swamps are real, sewage is a legitimate concern. But here is what the official story does not explain. Why were the lower floors of Chicago buildings already buried before the raising project began? Early photographs show workers excavating mud and sediment from around building foundations. They were not just lifting structures, they were uncovering them, digging them out of compacted earth that had somehow accumulated to depths of 6, 8, even 12 feet. Where did that earth come from? Not from the Chicago River. River floods leave silt that washes away. This was dense, packed material that had to be removed with shovels and carts, not from gradual accumulation over time. Chicago was barely 20 years old when these projects began. There had not been enough time for natural buildup of this magnitude. The same pattern repeats in Boston. In the 1850s and 60s, The city undertook massive land reclamation projects that supposedly created new neighborhoods from tidal flats. But the photographic record tells a different story. Workers digging down, buildings with windows below grade, entire floors sealed and converted to basements. The same compacted earth, the same excavation techniques, the same unanswered questions. San Francisco presents perhaps the most striking evidence. After the 1879 earthquake, and again after 1906, the city rebuilt itself on top of previous layers. Today you can walk through underground Seattle-style tours and see entire streets preserved beneath the modern city. Storefronts with their original signage, sidewalks with their original paving, windows and doors that once opened at ground level, now buried under 10 or 15 feet of fill. The city explains this as earthquake debris and fire rubble. But the buried architecture does not look damaged. It looks preserved. Intact facades, unbroken windows, structures that appear far older than their supposed construction dates. And then there is Denver. The mile-high city built literally on top of previous construction. Walk through certain downtown areas and you can see it. Older stonework visible at basement level. Window frames half buried in concrete. Architectural details that do not match the buildings above them. Seattle made a tourist attraction out of its buried floors. After the 1889 fire, the city raised its streets by 1 to 2 stories and built new structures on top of the old. Today you can take underground tours through the original street level, complete with storefronts and sidewalks preserved exactly as they were. The tour guides explain it as your fire reconstruction. But the buried buildings do not look burned. They look buried, swallowed by earth that nobody can fully explain. Portland, Oregon tells its own version of the story. The city's underground tunnel system, known as the Shanghai Tunnels, officially served as passageways for moving goods from ships to basement storage. But walk through these tunnels today and you will notice something strange. The construction quality exceeds what you would expect from improvised merchant passages. The brickwork is precise. The arches are mathematically calculated. The scale suggests something more significant than simple cargo routes. Local legends speak of kidnapping and forced labor, convenient explanations that distract from the architectural questions. Why are these tunnels built to standards that exceed their supposed purpose? Why do they connect buildings that were theoretically constructed independently? Why does the underground Portland look more planned and more permanent than the surface city that supposedly built it? Philadelphia presents equally puzzling evidence. The city that served as America's first capital has basement levels that do not match the historical record. Independence Hall itself sits on foundations that extend deeper than colonial-era construction techniques should allow. Benjamin Franklin's Philadelphia was supposedly a wooden city rebuilt in brick after fires. Yet the underground structures suggest something more permanent existed before. New Orleans, famous for its above-ground cemeteries because the water table is too high for burial, somehow has extensive basement levels throughout the French Quarter. If the ground is too wet for graves, how did 18th century builders construct underground spaces that remain dry today? The engineering required seems beyond the capabilities attributed to colonial Louisiana. And then there is Washington, D.C., a city planned from scratch in the 1790s. Official history tells us Pierre L'Enfant designed the capital on empty land, creating wide boulevards and monumental architecture from nothing. Yet construction workers over the years have discovered underground structures that predate the official founding, tunnels that do not appear on any map, foundations that extend below the planned basement levels, stone construction that does not match the recorded building materials. The pattern repeats in city after city across America. Underground spaces that exceed their supposed purpose. Foundations deeper than historical records indicate. Architecture more sophisticated than official construction, dates allow. And always the same response from authorities. Denial, dismissal, alternative explanations that raise more questions than they answer. Here is where the mystery deepens. Because the buried floors in American cities are not crude pioneer construction. They are not rough wooden shacks or primitive brick buildings that you would expect from frontier towns barely a few decades old. They are sophisticated, precise, massive, built with techniques that supposedly did not exist in mid-19th century America. Examine the stonework in Chicago's buried levels, and you will find masonry of remarkable quality. Perfectly fitted blocks, precise geometric patterns, arches engineered with mathematical accuracy, the kind of construction that takes generations to develop, appearing in a city that was officially founded in 1833. Look at the foundations uncovered during Boston's excavations, and you will find structures deeper and more complex than any official blueprint indicates. Sub-basements beneath basements, corridors extending in directions that do not appear on any map, stone walls of unknown origin predating the recorded history of the buildings above. San Francisco's buried streets reveal architectural details that do not match the Gold Rush-era construction they are supposed to represent. Window proportions that follow classical ratios, facade decorations that mirror European Old World designs, building techniques that American contractors of the 1850s supposedly had not yet learned. This is the pattern that researchers call Tartarian architecture. Not because they believe in some mythical empire, but because the style appears globally with disturbing consistency. The same proportions, the same geometric precision, the same oversized windows, the same deep foundations, the same quality of stonework, appearing in cities on different continents that supposedly had no architectural connection. Mainstream historians explain this as classical influence. Greek and Roman revival styles were popular in the 19th century, they say. American architects copied European designs. There is nothing mysterious about it. But classical influence does not explain why these buildings were buried. It does not explain why the buried layers consistently look older and more sophisticated than the construction above them. It does not explain how frontier cities barely a few decades old produce masonry that rivals thousand-year-old European cathedrals. And it does not explain the global synchronicity of the burial events. Because here's the fact that no historian has adequately addressed. The buried architecture in Chicago matches the buried architecture in Warsaw. The underground floors of Boston mirror the underground floors of St. Petersburg. San Francisco's preserved streets share design elements with Istanbul's buried quarters. Denver's basement stonework echoes Vienna's subterranean levels. Either 19th century builders across the world independently developed identical architectural styles and then simultaneously buried them, or they were all uncovering the same thing. The official term is street raising, urban improvement, municipal modernization. These phrases appear in every historical account of mid-19th century city development. They sound progressive, forward-thinking, the kind of infrastructure investment that growing cities naturally undertake. But examine the actual work being done and the terminology falls apart. Street raising implies building upward, so adding height to existing surfaces, constructing new levels above old ones. That is not what the photographs show. The photographs show workers digging downward, removing compacted earth from around buildings, uncovering buried entrances, exposing windows that have been swallowed by soil. This is not raising. This is excavation. Archaeological recovery disguised as civil engineering. The language in period documents betrays the truth if you read carefully enough. Engineers complain about unexpected foundation depths. Workers report discovering chambers below the recorded base level. Contractors request additional funding to deal with subterranean structures not indicated on plans. Newspapers briefly mention ancient stonework uncovered during street improvement, then never follow up on the story. These phrases appear across cities that supposedly had no communication or coordination. Boston engineers used almost identical language to their counterparts in Chicago. San Francisco contractors reported the same unexpected discoveries as workers in Denver. The coincidences pile up until they stop looking like coincidences, and the physical labor involved defies imagination. Consider what moving millions of tons of earth requires without modern machinery. No bulldozers, no excavators, no dump trucks. Every shovelful moved by hand, every cartload hauled by horse, every ton of soil lifted and transported through muscle power alone. The workforce required for operations of this scale would have represented a significant percentage of each city's population. Where did these workers come from? Immigration records from the period show massive influxes of laborers from Europe and Asia, but the timing and destinations match suspiciously well with the excavation projects. Were cities recruiting workers specifically for this purpose? Was there a coordinated labor migration to supply the digging crews? The financial questions are equally troubling. These excavation projects cost fortunes in an era when city budgets barely covered basic services. Who paid for the workers, the equipment, the years of continuous operation? Some projects received federal funding through obscure provisions. Others were financed by private interests whose identities remain unclear in the historical record. Money flowed from somewhere, but the sources are remarkably difficult to trace. The scale of these operations defies the official narrative. In Chicago alone, hundreds of buildings were involved. Thousands of workers labored for years. Millions of tons of earth were moved. The cost in today's dollars would exceed billions. And this was happening in a young city still recovering from rapid growth without the industrial machinery we take for granted today. Where did the money come from? Where did the workers come from? Where did the organizational capacity come from to coordinate such a massive undertaking? The same questions apply to every city that underwent similar transformations. Boston, San Francisco, New York, Seattle, Denver. None of these were wealthy established metropolises with centuries of accumulated resources. They were frontier towns and young cities struggling to meet basic infrastructure needs. Yet somehow they all managed to launch excavation efforts of unprecedented scale within the same historical window. And the excavations followed suspiciously similar patterns. First, workers would clear the compacted earth from around building foundations, exposing the original ground floor. Then they would stabilize the revealed structures, reinforcing walls and shoring up foundations. Then they would restore access to buried entrances, cutting through packed soil to reach original doors and windows. Then, crucially, they would stop. They never fully excavated. They cleared just enough to restore functionality, then sealed the rest permanently. Entire underground floors were left buried. Sub-basements were filled with rubble and forgotten. Lower levels were converted to storage or abandoned entirely. Why stop? If the goal was restoration, why not restore completely? If these buildings had value, why leave half of them underground? If the buried floors were functional spaces, why seal them forever? The answer becomes clear when you consider what further excavation might have revealed. Structures too old for the official timeline. Architecture too advanced for the supposed builders. Evidence that did not fit the narrative of American progress and expansion. It was safer to stop digging. Safer to seal the lower levels. Safer to raise the streets and pretend the buried world had never existed. Here is the detail that transforms this mystery from local anomaly to global conspiracy. The timing. Chicago's street-raising projects occurred primarily between 1855 and 1870. Boston's major excavations took place between 1850 and 1865. San Francisco's buried layers date from the 1850s through the 1870s. New York's underground infrastructure work concentrated in the 1860s and 70s. Now compare this to Europe. Paris underwent its famous Haussmann renovations between 1853 and 1870. Vienna reconstructed its urban core between 1850 and 1890. Warsaw's street-raising projects occurred throughout the 1850s and 60s. St. Petersburg's excavations and reconstructions clustered in the same decades. A 40-year window, 1840 to 1880, across two continents, dozens of cities, different governments and languages and political systems, yet the same phenomenon, the same response, the same timeline. This is not coincidence. Coincidence does not operate with this precision across this scale. Something happened globally between 1840 and 1880 that required a coordinated response. And that response involved excavating buried structures that nobody wanted to acknowledge. The geopolitical context makes the coordination even more remarkable. During this period, America was tearing itself apart in civil war. Europe was convulsing with revolutions and national unification movements. Britain and France were competing for colonial dominance. Russia was reforming its feudal system. These were not governments with spare capacity for international cooperation on urban engineering projects. Yet the excavations proceeded regardless. Union and Confederate cities alike reported the same buried floors and undertook the same recovery efforts. Revolutionary Paris and Imperial Vienna experienced identical architectural anomalies. Colonial outposts and independent nations showed the same patterns. Whatever forced this response transcended political divisions. Whatever required these excavations was more important than the wars and revolutions that consumed governmental attention. The buried architecture had to be addressed even while nations were otherwise destroying each other. Consider what coordination of this magnitude would require. Communication across oceans in an era before telephones and reliable telegraph. Agreement between governments that were often rivals or outright enemies. Shared engineering techniques and construction methods. Consistent instructions for what to uncover and what to leave buried. Either this coordination existed, implying a level of global organization that official history does not recognize, or something forced identical responses from unconnected cities facing identical situations. A global event that deposited identical layers of earth around identical architecture, prompting identical recovery efforts. The Tartarian researchers call this the mud flood. A catastrophic event that buried the previous civilization under meters of compacted sediment, whether caused by natural disaster, cosmic event, or something else entirely. The result was the same. Cities around the world woke up to find their buildings swallowed by earth, and they responded by digging out what they could and sealing what they could not explain. This theory sounds outlandish until you consider the alternative. That dozens of unconnected cities independently experienced identical burial events within the same decades, independently decided to respond with identical excavation techniques, and independently agreed to never discuss the buried architecture that did not fit their official histories. Which explanation requires more faith? The most compelling proof of this buried history is also the most accessible. You do not need to dig through archives or decode ancient documents. You just need to look. Walk through any major American city and pay attention to the architecture at street level. Notice how many buildings have windows that seem too close to the ground. Windows with elaborate decorative frames positioned mere inches above the sidewalk. Windows that would have been at comfortable eye level if the ground were several feet lower. Notice the entrances. How many buildings have steps leading down to basement doors that look more like main entrances? Decorative stonework around basement windows that seems excessive for a storage space? Architectural details below grade that match or exceed the quality above. Notice the foundations. In cities across America, you can see exposed stonework at basement level that does not match the brick or concrete above. Older construction methods, different materials, superior craftsmanship, as if the building below is older and more sophisticated than the building on top. Visit the underground tours offered in cities like Seattle, Portland, and Chicago. Listen to the official explanations about fires and floods and urban improvement. Then look at the architecture with your own eyes. Notice how the buried structures seem more solid, more permanent, more carefully constructed than the buildings above. Ask yourself why fire debris or flood sediment would preserve storefronts so perfectly. Question why urban improvement would require sealing functional spaces forever. The underground shopping areas beneath major cities reveal similar anomalies. Chicago's pedway system, the underground concourses in Montreal and Toronto, the basement-level retail in Manhattan and Boston. These spaces are presented as modern convenience, but many of them incorporate older structures that predate their supposed construction dates. Walls that do not match the buildings above. Foundations that extend in unexpected directions. Architectural details that belong to different eras. Even suburban areas show evidence of the buried layer. Construction crews digging foundations for new developments occasionally report discovering unexpected structures. Old stonework where none should exist. Brick patterns that predate local settlement. Underground chambers with no recorded history. Most of these discoveries go unreported in mainstream media. The construction continues, the old structures are demolished or incorporated, and the questions are never asked. But the workers remember, the contractors know, the evidence exists for those willing to seek it. These observations are not hidden. They are visible to anyone who takes the time to look. The buried architecture is literally right beneath our feet, visible through basement windows and excavation sites in urban archaeological digs. And then there are the photographs. Early images from the 1850s and 60s showing the excavation process in real time. Workers removing earth from around building foundations. Doors and windows emerging from packed soil. Structures being literally unearthed. These photographs appear in historical archives and library collections across the country. They are not suppressed or classified. They are simply not discussed. Historians file them under street improvement and urban development and move on without asking the obvious questions. Why were these buildings buried? When did the burial occur? How did so much earth accumulate so quickly around structures that were supposedly built recently? Why does the buried architecture look older than the construction above? The photographs do not answer these questions, but they prove the questions are valid. The burial was real. The excavation was real. The buried architecture exists. What remains hidden is only the explanation. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this mystery is not the buried buildings, or the synchronized excavations, or the architectural anomalies. It is what happened afterward. After the digging stopped, after the streets were raised, after the lower floors were sealed, the historical record was quietly rewritten. The buried architecture was not studied, it was not documented, it was not preserved for future investigation. It was simply erased from official memory. City records describe street-raising projects without mentioning what was being raised from. Engineering reports detail excavation work without explaining what was being excavated. Historical accounts praise urban modernization without acknowledging the older architecture that modernization replaced. The photographs survived because photography was new and exciting and people documented everything. But the context was stripped away. Images of workers digging out buried buildings were relabeled as construction scenes. Pictures of half-buried facades were filed under street improvement. Evidence of the excavation became evidence of ordinary urban development. And the buried floors themselves were left to decay. Sealed basements filled with water and debris. Underground levels collapsed or were deliberately demolished. The architectural evidence was physically destroyed, even as the photographic evidence was contextually erased. This is not natural historical amnesia. This is systematic suppression. Someone decided that the buried architecture should not be remembered. Someone coordinated the relabeling and recontextualizing of evidence. Someone ensured that future generations would see street improvement where they should see excavation and recovery. Who made this decision? The same coordination that organized the excavations appears to have organized the cover-up. The same global network that responded to the burial event ensured that the burial would be forgotten. And for over a century, it worked. The buried cities became tourist attractions and basement storage and underground parking. The photographs gathered dust in archives. The questions were never asked. Until now, because the internet has changed everything. Researchers can compare photographs from Chicago and Warsaw and St. Petersburg and see the identical patterns. Amateur historians can access engineering reports from different continents and notice the identical language. Curious individuals can visit buried floors in different cities and observe the identical architecture. The evidence can no longer be isolated and suppressed. The pattern can no longer be hidden by geographic distance and language barriers. The questions can no longer be dismissed as conspiracy theory when the photographs speak for themselves. Something happened between 1840 and 1880, something global, something catastrophic, something that buried an older civilization under meters of earth. And the 19th century response was not construction, but excavation. Not building, but recovery. Not creation, but rediscovery. The great unearthing was exactly that. An unearthing. And what they found beneath the mud was not their own recent construction. It was something older, something more advanced, something that did not fit the story they wanted to tell about human progress in American expansion and the triumph of modern civilization. So they buried it again. Not with mud this time, but with silence. We have covered a lot of ground in this investigation, literally and figuratively. From Chicago to Warsaw, from Boston to St. Petersburg, from San Francisco to Vienna, the evidence points to something that official history refuses to acknowledge: a global burial event sometime before 1840. Meters of compacted earth suddenly appearing around buildings across continents, and a coordinated recovery effort that excavated just enough to restore functionality while leaving the deeper questions forever underground. The Tartarian connection is not mythology. It is the recognition that buried architecture across the world shares consistent features that do not match their supposed construction dates, features that suggest an older and more sophisticated civilization, features that someone went to great lengths to hide. But questions remain. What caused the burial? Natural disaster? Cosmic event? Something else entirely? The geological record should provide answers, yet mainstream geology seems uninterested in investigating. Who coordinated the excavations? What organization had the global reach and resources to direct recovery efforts across continents? What authority decided what to uncover and what to seal? What entity ensured that the historical record would be rewritten? And perhaps most importantly, what else remains buried? The excavations stopped when they did for a reason. The sealed basements and collapsed underground levels hide something that 19th century authorities did not want exposed. The evidence is there for anyone willing to look. The photographs, the architectural anomalies, the buried floors, the synchronized timeline, the coordinated response, the systematic suppression. This is not about believing in lost civilizations or mythical empires. This is about asking questions that the evidence demands. Questions that official history has refused to answer for over 150 years. The great unearthing happened. The buried cities are real. The only mystery is why we are not supposed to talk about it. If this investigation opened your eyes to questions mainstream history ignores, smash that like button and let the algorithm know this content matters. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell because we are just getting started. There are more miraculous secrets waiting to be uncovered, more photographs waiting to be analyzed, more questions waiting to be asked. Join me next time as we dig even deeper into the evidence they tried to bury twice, once with mud and once with silence. See you in the next one.